بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على خاتم الأنبياء وإمام المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ورضي الله تعالى عن السادة التابعين والعلماء آملين وأئمة الأربعة المجتهدين ومقالديهم إلا يوم الدين أما بعد بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والذين جاهدوا فينا لنهدينهم سبلنا إن شر الدواب عند الله صم البكم الذين لا يعقلون. Initially, my intention was to cover a book written by Sheikh Muhammad Bello dealing with the soul of the prayer, or the core of the prayer, or the reality of the prayer, Ruh Salah. But I felt it was important to make this particular pivot that I'm going to make. And the subject will now be who is Allah? Or we can also entitle it, what is a God, or what constitutes a God, because He is the only one. This is what we contend, He is the only one. And I think it was necessary to make this change because of the responses I've been getting on my channel. This is one of the last videos that I intend to make to address this issue, because I really want to get on to bigger and better things. But this is very important to make it clear. So for this, I'll primarily be using parts of two particular texts. One will be a text written by Sheikh Uthman ibn Fudi, rahimahullah tabarak wa ta'ala, the great West African scholar and Mujtahid Imam, as well as Mujahid Imam. And it's called Kitab al-Ulum al-Mu'amala, which is a book that covers creed, worship, as well as spirituality. But I'll be focusing in on just a small section dealing with the creed. Also, I'll be using a traditional text that is very famous in North Africa, West Africa, and all of the places where the Maliki school of law is practiced. And this is none other than Ibn Ashur's text. Both of these texts are books that I have been given permission to teach from various teachers, as well as I have studied them at the hands of teachers. So, alhamdulillah. Before starting, I'd like to say, when we talk about discussing who is Allah, from the standpoint of convincing someone that, number one, Allah has to exist, or a God exists, and who Allah is and what Allah is not, there's two approaches. One approach isn't really necessary, but you may have to not discuss the existence of Allah or God, but maybe some attributes about Him here and there. And that's when you're talking to a believer. A believer. So with a believer, you use primarily the text. But then the other situation one is in is when you have to have this discussion with a disbeliever. Whether the disbeliever is an atheistic person who does not believe in the existence of any type of God or deity at all, an agnostic who doesn't know, isn't sure, isn't convinced one way or the other, or someone who claims to be a monotheist or believe in a God like a Christian, who you believe has an incorrect understanding or concept of God. When you're in this particular situation, the best mode is to go outside of the text and to use a tool that God had given all of us, the intellect. The intellect, for a moment, is a tool that God has given us that is wired to know Him. And what I mean by that is, if the intellect is healthy, if it isn't diseased, if it isn't full of just a bunch of mental illness, healthy intellect that is able to grasp concepts, that is able to be responsible for one's actions. The intellect is a tool that when presented when presented options, if it's healthy, it would typically choose what's beneficial to it or what makes more rational sense to it, or what we call logic. Okay? And there's no problem with using the intellect when it comes to this. I don't know why there are some people who argue and debate it. We have what Allah Ta'ala says in many places where He addresses the use of the intellect, where He almost makes it necessary that one uses the intellect. There's constant appeals to the intellect in the Quran. And here's a straight verse where Allah Ta'ala censors those who do not use the intellect when He says, Inna sharra al-dawabi inda Allahi summun bukumu ladina la ya'qilun. He says, indeed, inna, for emphasis, indeed, the worst of all creatures in the sight of Allah are the deaf and the dumb, those who do not use their intellect, those who don't use their intellect. So we see automatically a place for the intellect, for the aql, especially in the area of proving the existence of Allah to someone who doesn't believe in the Quran. For a person who doesn't believe in the Quran, you could recite verses all day, and it means nothing to them because they don't believe in the Quran. So when debating these types of individuals, it's important to go and use the intellect to prove to them these things. Then once you're successful in doing this, if you're successful in doing that, then we can go into proving whether this God who exists clearly will reveal a text and show why the Quran would be the text that He would reveal. This is the methodology we will use. So in Islam, we have our scholars have determined that there are certain qualities that one must have to be a God. And why is this important? This is important because it enables the human being to automatically, to rationally be able to deduce what is not a God, which is very important. Because throughout history, people have worshipped all types of things and called it a God. There have been sun gods. There have been moon gods. There have been gods of war. There have been gods of fertility. There have been gods of agriculture. There have been gods of the sea. There have been gods of the heaven. There have been gods of the Hades. There have been gods of the mountains. Okay? There have been gods of thunder. There have been gods of lightning. There have been gods of water. The human beings since the beginning of time have been led astray in all of these areas. There have been gods of animals like bull gods and cow gods. And the list goes on. And the reason, and then you have the man gods. Okay? Typically the man gods were individuals who felt like they had to claim deity in order to get the obedience of subjects. Alexander the Great was an example of this. Julius Caesar tried this. The most famous man to have ever done this, well, two most famous men. One is Nimrod, okay, who lived during the time of Abraham. And then you got the Pharaoh, who lived during the time of Prophet Moses. These are two most famous guys who claim to be deities themselves. Matter of fact, at a certain portion in Egyptian history, talking ancient Egypt, the Pharaoh itself was seen as a deific title. Okay? So humanity has gone astray in this area and in this regard. And one of the primary reasons is they don't know what a God cannot be. And the most dangerous thing that you can have is no laws, no limits for this. What we've had recently, we've had a man named Elijah Muhammad claim that a man named W.D. Farad appeared in 1930 and that he was God, Allah, in the flesh. Okay? We've had Father Divine, Jim Jones, and I don't know the details of all of their belief systems, but we've had a number of people make claims about themselves and about worshiping this and that. We've had in the African American community, this individual who called himself Allah, A'udhu Billah, this guy Clarence 13X, who was once a part of the Nation of Islam, broke off and starts his own group, and then he taught part of some stuff not Elijah Muhammad taught, that the black man is God, the maker, the molder, cream of the planet Earth, father of civilization, God of the universe. You still have some people walking around here talking about, we're gods and we can be gods, and number of different things like that. Okay? And this comes from just a general ignorance on the part of the human being of what a God is or what a God cannot be. So what I'm going to present today from the works of the Islamic scholars, because Islamic scholars are mercy to mankind, The intellect that Allah had blessed our ummah with is so unbelievable. If you look at the preservation of the Quran, if you look at the preservation of the science of hadith, no religion, no spiritual tradition has what we have. So much special, brothers and sisters. And I don't get into these debates with these Christians. I don't get into this debate with you people about whether or not the Bible or the Quran is preserved. I will prove to you in 30 seconds how the Quran is preserved and the Bible is not. Number one, let's do this. If the Quran was lost and the Bible was lost, just imagine a world where every single copy of them were just lost, burnt to the ground, every single last one of them. I can guarantee you that within a day, within 24 hours, I'm talking about the physical copies of the Quran, were gone. That within 24 hours, every single Muslim city in the world, including places like Philadelphia and New York, would have a fresh Quran ready without a mistake in it. Within a day. Every city around the world. Don't even forget about places like Saudi and Karachi, Pakistan, or places like that. Africa. And the reason being because the method of preservation, the primary method of preservation, is the hearts of its worshipers. We memorize the Quran. I can run off chapters of the Quran for you, and I'm not even a hafiz of the Quran, but I can run off chapters of Quran for you that will never be lost. Every diacritical mark is in my head. I know exactly how it's supposed to sound. Can you make that claim about the Bible? Can you make that claim about the Bible? And what I'm telling you, if this is the case now for Muslims, when Islam is weak compared to what it was in terms of a community, yes, we have numbers, but we don't have the khilafah like we had. We don't have the type of dominance that we had. We don't run the world banks and all of those things like we did. Muslims in this state, which by our standards is a state of weakness, still can preserve the Quran. So during the time when Muslims were the most powerful nation on the planet, had empires, that they definitely were preserving the Quran. You know that. Actually, the same with the hadith I was saying. There are those who memorize the hadith. This is our tradition. We also have something that nobody else has. That's the isnad, going back. Well, these books I'm teaching you, I have teachers that gave me permission to teach them, who got it from teachers who gave them permission to teach them. Going back to teachers who gave them permission to teach them. Going back to the author of the books. This is something we require in our tradition that no other tradition does. We take our stuff serious. And then you wonder why, we're the type of people that get upset if you insult a prophet or if you insult the Quran and stuff like that. Because Allah put that in our hearts that we take these things serious. Can you do that for the Bible? Can you bring me one person that memorized it from cover to cover? One person. Wallahi, personally, I know 10 people that can memorize, that can recite the whole Quran to you from beginning to end. Personally. And I can't tell you how many I met in my travels. I can't even tell you how many I met in my travels. Wallahi. Now that means I swear by Allah. Now, who is Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala? Allah, of course, we say that He is the creator of everything, the one who has power over all things, the all-seeing, the all-knowing, all-omnipotent one who has sent all the different prophets, who has sent all the different messengers, who created all the angels, who is in charge and in control of everything. That's Allah, that one. Created the earth, heavens, everything. But this is what we understand about Him when it comes to talking about His existence and why He must exist. Subhanahu wa ta'ala. We've narrowed down, our scholars have narrowed down what are called sifat al-salbiyah. What these are necessary attributes for Allah. They're not His only attributes, but they're necessary attributes for anything that claims to be a deity. And what we say, He's the only one that can be described by these attributes. The one that's described by these attributes, that's God, that's Allah. According to Ibn Ashur, radiyallahu anhu, says, يجب لله الوجود والقدم كذا البقاء وغنى مطلق عام وخلفه لخلقه بلا مثال ووهوة ذاته ووصف والفعال وقدرة إرادة علم حياة سمع كلام بصر ذي واجبات. Listen. He says, the following attributes are necessary, okay? For Allah, these attributes are necessary. They must be. In order to be a God, you got to be described by this. The first is existence. God must exist at all times. Well, just existence. We'll get into time in a second, but existence. Beginninglessness, okay? Meaning exists without ever having not existed. Beginninglessness. He has no beginning. Likewise, he has to have permanence without an end. There's no ending. There's no starting point, and there's no ending. He has to have absolute and universal independence. Al-Ghani. He has to be totally independent. Talking about in his nature and also in his actions and in his ability to do things. Okay? Independent. Give an example what we mean by independent. We have eyesight. God has eyesight. Our eyesight is dependent on an organ called an eye that has a pupil, that has other inner workings, that needs blood running through it, and all of these different things. It needs light, so on, reflecting, and how all the details of how the eyes work. Whereas God, his sight is not dependent on eyes. He just sees by his nature. Okay? That means that sight is obligatory for him, but sight is not obligatory for us. We know that because you have human beings like Stevie Wonder, Ray Charles. You're blind people. So it's not necessary for us to be able to see. Okay? Independence. Everything's independent in everything. Is hearing. Independent. Don't need ears to hear. He can speak, but doesn't need a mouth to do it. Independence. Okay? وَخَلْفُهُ لِخَلْقِهِ بِلَا مِثَالٍ. He is different, completely different from all of his creation without similarity. He's not similar to his creation. He's different. And he's one in his self, his attributes, and his actions. He's one. Can't be broken into parts. Okay? These are the attributes. Now, there are other attributes, of course, like hearing, speech, and sight. These things are proven by revelation. And he has to have that, right? Knowledge, power. These are also other attributes. But when we're talking about God, we're talking about those 5 attributes I just listed. Now, when we talk about proving these particular things, we're going to use the intellect. So put your thinking caps on a little bit. And this is from Shaykh Uthman ibn Fudi, rahimahullah. We're going to go over to that. He said that our proof of his existence, that God exists, that he must exist, is that he brings about creation out of non-existence. Since the non-existent does not have any power to act by itself. All right, now this is an argument towards Big Bang people who don't believe in God. They have to believe that there was nothingness at some point. Something will not come out of nothing. It goes against the intellect. Now, we can live in la-la land and say, it's possible, hey, anything's possible, right? But we know it goes against the intellect from what we just know. That there's an idea of causation. There's no something that's going to come out of complete nothing. So there has to be one that always existed, who was not like things and started creating things. As it relates to his beginninglessness, our proof of that is that his power to bring into existence, creatures into existence, since the end time is powerless and cannot act. Okay? If you're in time, you would need something to bring you about because you, of your own volition, have no real power because you're an end-time creature that's subjected to time. What does being subjected to time mean? It means, well, you typically grow. You're young, and then you become adolescent, then you grow old, or you deteriorate, or you grow. That means you're subject to change. You're subject to time. Time affects you. Anything that is affected by time can't be a God. Because God had to create time, just like everything else. Time is part of creation. So the one who created time has to exist outside of time. And if he exists outside of time, the idea of having a beginning is inconceivable for him. Hopefully this makes sense. Okay? Our proof of his permanence or not having an ending is the permanence of his before timeness, since whatever is permanent in before timeness cannot possibly become non-existent, okay? And it's really the same thing here, but kind of like it's the logical conclusion to before timeness. If you exist outside of time, you can't have a beginning, and you also can't have an end because beginning and ending are just points of time. Okay? So God has to exist in a way that without beginning and has to go on without end. Now, with regards to the next attribute, which is that he's separate from his creation, خلفه لخلقه بلا مثال, or مخالفات للحوادث, he's separate from all right, his separation from end time events is his power to bring them into existence, because the one who has no light cannot be brought into existence. And to go further on that was some things that my teacher has explained to me. If he has a likeness that's like creation, like if he has a likeness, if he has if he's subject to like being a particular size, particular weight, or having particular features, right? Like I have features. Someone would have had to determine what his features would be, right? Someone would have to determine that. So that it would necessitate another God who determined that he would be a particular size, a particular weight, have particular limits, all of these different things. And that's irrational, okay? So the God who created everything, he has to not be subject to these different things: size, weight, mass, okay, color, all of these different things. And then if you study physics, even when you talk about color, weight, mass, and all of that, you would know it's impossible even more if you were a physicist. As I looked into these things a little bit more, and it's like, yeah, God wouldn't be subject to those things, because all of those things have dependencies at different points. Like a color has dependency on light, right? God not dependent, so that's impossible. Weight is kind of dependent on gravity, you see, and bending space and all of these different things. And those things would not be applicable to God, the one who created it all. Now, with regard to him being totally independent, his richness beyond dependence on place of door is the fact that he must be described by intrinsic meanings and meaningfulness, because an attribute cannot be described by them. All right. To add to this here, he has to be completely independent, and we got into that a little earlier, that if he's dependent on anything, then the one he's dependent on that's God, right? There has to be one being, if you will, for lack of a better word, that all others are dependent upon, who himself is independent. And that one is the one we call God, Allahu Tabarakahu wa Ta'ala. Now, there are other attributes that he has to have. Knowledge, meaning he knows everything. Seeing, or sight, sees everything. Hearing, okay? But we understand all of these different attributes in light of these, like independence. It's before time. It has no end, okay? So he's completely different beyond our scope of being able to really imagine or explain with our minds, okay? Now, this is the part where we try to kind of explain this to other religions, especially Christians. Jews seem to have some understanding of this. Don't have much problem with it. Just like there are things that are necessary for a God, there are things that are impossible for a God. If a being or a thing has any of these particular attributes, that's automatically not a God. You automatically know it's not a God. And these things are basically the opposite of the necessary attributes. Because in logic, what's necessary, the opposite is what's impossible. And they are. Non-existence. For example, since existence is necessary, non-existence is impossible. Okay? Now, I know with the Christians, when you're dealing with them, you would automatically say to them, if there was a point where Jesus didn't exist, then that would mean he's not a God. So then, of course, now they changed their doctrine. They changed their doctrine up. So now they try to say that he always existed with God. Okay? Trying to say he's the Word and all of that kind of stuff. All right. So that's what they try to do. Always existed with him and so on. So the makeup of God is that he's a Father, he's Son, and a Holy Spirit. So they try to say. All right. Now, ending, that he has that down beginninglessness, they try to claim that. Eternal without an ending. This is difficult for them to try and prove because they believe Jesus died. They believe Jesus died. This is very problematic because death is death. It means you transitioned from one state to the next. Your physical flesh died. So now they have to believe that Jesus, his physical body, was something other than God. But this kind of goes against their doctrine that he was fully God and fully man, which is irrational. But if we're even going to go with it, we would have to at least admit, at least to them who believe he died, that his physical body came to an end. It ceased to function. It ceased to work. He had to be a corpse laid in the ground, whether you believe he was resurrected or not. They believe that he was subject to change. For the Muslim, this will be an automatic rejection of a God. God isn't subject to that, to change it all. The next attribute is absolute and universal independence. How would Jesus have that when in their book they say that he says that he was sent? In his story, he was once in the womb of a woman. And anyone in the womb of the woman is connected by an umbilical cord to the woman and feeds off of the woman. So that's neediness. It's not independence. So their God, who they worship, at one point was dependent. He was born through a birth canal, according to our tradition and theirs. He was a baby. Alhamdulillah, in the Muslim tradition, he was a baby who spoke in the cradle, which is an amazing thing, but yet still a baby, held. He had to be held. It's dependence. So Muslims will reject that. Christians believe he couldn't talk. They believe that's an apocryphal story, that he couldn't talk. So he's even more dependent. He was subject to time. Then he was a baby. Then he becomes a toddler who can't walk. Becomes a toddler, learns how to walk. God's learning how to walk to them. Grows up, goes through adolescence. Becomes a man. Subject to time, space. He's totally inside time and space. Where the Christian and the Muslim would disagree here, we believe God Does not enter time and space. The whole realm of time and space, everything that has to deal with creation is beneath him. Subhanallah, highly glorified is he above such things and such a concept. He doesn't enter into the space that he created, like a human being builds a house and moves in. No, Allah Ta'ala doesn't need to be sitting anywhere, need to be existing anywhere. He is Allah. There's no need of time, spaces and places. He created all of that. This is the normative belief of the Muslims. You'll hear some Muslims out there try to argue that Allah is like sitting on a chair or something like that. But this is not the belief of normative Muslims. Sunni Muslims. It's not their beliefs. And on Day of Judgment, Allah will clear that up between the Muslims. Inshallah. Then the next attribute is that he is one in his entity, attributes, and actions. And of course, the Christians disagree with that. That God is not one in his entity, he's three in his entity. Which for us is immediately not only refuted in the Quran, but it's also irrational. It's irrational. They try to explain it. They use all this technical vocabulary that you find going back to the Nicene Creed and so on. I'm not going to get into that right now because all of it at the end of the day is still in violation of this particular principle that we have, a wahdiniyah. No, he's one in his entity. It's not three separate persons who are all a God. We reject that as being a God. Immediate rejection. He's one in his entities, one in his attributes. All of his attributes are one. He's one in all of those things. All those attributes belong to the one entity. And they're not separate persons. Okay? They're not personalities or anything like that. They're just descriptions of the one entity. And he's one in his actions. Okay? He has power, he has will, he has knowledge, he has life, he has hearing, speech, and sight. All of these things are necessary for him, but we have to understand all of these in light of the Sifat al-Salbiyah. That is power. It was never a time when he didn't have the power. He always had it and always will, because it's part of his essence. It's who he is. His will is permanent. It's beginningless. Same thing with his knowledge. It encompasses everything. It's beginningless. It isn't that he only knows the particulars, but he doesn't know the generals. No, he knows all of it, everything. Nothing escapes his knowledge. Not an animal in the sea, not a leaf that falls off a tree, not a hair that stands on the head of anyone, not a cell, not an atom that exists somewhere inside the body of someone. None of it exists without his knowledge. He knows everything down to his finest, minute detail. He is life, of course. And his life is beginningless. It doesn't end. It's not subject to change, not subject to time, space, any of that. Hearing. His hearing is limitless. It's not subject to time. It's not subject to space. It's not subject to distance. None of these things that he created is his attributes subject to. His speech, same way. And his speech is not subject to beginning. It's not subject to ending. It's not subjected to language. It's not subject to anything. And the nature of it, its real nature of it, is something that we don't know completely because we haven't been made privy to that. Our intellect has not been granted that. His sight, same thing. It's without beginning. It's without end. It's without limits. And we don't say that the things that are impossible for Allah are limiting him, putting limits or placing limits upon him. No. What we're saying is that he is glorified beyond that. So when we say God can't become a man, what we're saying is that he's highly glorified beyond the concept of being a man, and that now the idea of it is degrading. That's what we're saying. He's highly glorified beyond that. And this for us is our description. Brief, like it's just scratching the surface of Allah. We talk about him because when you get into the spiritual aspects and you get into his mercy, you get into his guiding, and you get into his love, and we get into those different types of things, you're really diving into a deep ocean that even this science cannot explain. That's when you're talking about forging a relationship with Allah, where he takes you as a friend, and then he starts to open up the secrets of the universe to you through ma'rifah, right? Through this experiential knowledge that one reaches once you become beloved to Allah. And the journey really starts for the soul, for the Muslim, for the believer. But it all starts here. You can't have a false idea who he is. You can't be out here promoting, and really slandering and degrading him. Can't be out here doing that. Can't be out here disrespecting the prophets that he sent. Any of them. Any of them. Can't be disrespecting the books that he revealed. Any of them. Can't be out here slandering his angels. None of that stuff. You have to hold all of those things as sacred. And then pray that he accepts you and me. I pray for myself first, okay? That he accepts us in our efforts. That he's pleased with us. He guides us. And may he keep you all safe. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.